The spring of 1945 inches northern Germany was marked by an unusual combination of uneasy silence and the omnipresent traces of destruction. For people who had lived through years of war, the change of seasons no longer symbolized renewal. In those final weeks of the conflict, each day seemed suspended between past and future, between fear and hope. On the territory of one Allied prisoner of war camp, established in late April 1945, stood a series of recently built wooden structures, hastily assembled by British and Canadian engineers to house women who had belonged to various auxiliary units of the Third Reich. The camp was officially considered temporary and transitional, designed for the processing and later redistribution of prisoners. Female groups in such facilities were uncommon, but the rapid advance of Allied forces brought increasing numbers of units where women served as communications staff, clerks, archivists, and technical personnel. Most of them had been captured suddenly, with no time for preparation or resistance. By early May, they were brought into the camp, where, alongside strict security measures, minimal living conditions were maintained. These conditions became one of the key factors shaping the atmosphere of the camp and the psychological state of its inhabitants. Allied command sought to avoid any violations of the Geneva Convention. Regular sanitary inspections were carried out, basic rations were issued, medical exams were organized, and a separate area was allocated for hygiene procedures. This zone consisted of several small barracks equipped with cold water, which was already considered an achievement given the broader shortage of resources. For the women, who had become accustomed to constant movement, air raids, alarms, and deteriorating living conditions during the last months of the war, the presence of a shower block felt almost like a sign that some semblance of normal life still existed. Despite these efforts, tension remained. Inside the wooden barracks, there was a mixture of exhaustion and uncertainty. Many of the women did not know what to expect. Extended detention, transfer, questioning, or a quick release. Although Allied soldiers treated them correctly, the fact of captivity itself was a heavy psychological blow. They quietly discussed their duties during service, the fate of their families, and the destruction of their cities, without daring to imagine what awaited them after the war's end. Within this setting, events occurred that later surprised even the Allied guards themselves. The shower block, located at the far edge of the camp, was arranged to provide women with as much privacy as possible given the temporary nature of the infrastructure. British engineers installed simple partitions and warning signs indicating restricted access. Despite strict instructions, the camp was still in the process of organization. Soldiers constantly received new tasks, changed posts, moved equipment, and inspected facilities. In the first days of May, activity in the camp increased noticeably. Isolated groups of prisoners were transferred to neighboring camps. Supply trucks arrived, and communications were checked. In this environment of hurried movement and incomplete instructions, an incident took place. Several young soldiers responsible for checking the water system mistakenly entered the wrong building. Confusing the markings on their outdated map, they expected to find an empty technical room. Instead, they unexpectedly stepped into the women's shower block. What followed was surprising. Instead of fear or shock, the reaction of the women reflected something entirely different. To understand this response, one had to consider their emotional exhaustion, the months of relentless tension, the absence of a normal social environment, and the sudden realization that what had just happened posed no danger. In wartime, any harmless mistake could appear almost like a sign of peace, a random, non-threatening moment that could exist only where fear had begun to recede. This incident became a starting point for a story that, while ambiguous, revealed much about the final months of the Second World War and about the fragile psychology of those who lived through its last, uncertain spring. By mid-May 1945, the camp to which the women had been brought functioned as one of many temporary collection points established by the Allies for the rapid processing of prisoners of war. Its structure reflected the disorganized character of the late war period. Some buildings had been freshly assembled from newly cut timber, while others were reconstructed farm structures left from the previous owners. The entire territory was divided into sectors, each with its own rules and level of access. The women's barracks were located in the eastern part of the camp, far from the main movement routes, a placement intended to maintain order and a degree of isolation. Allied command paid particular attention to preventing any disciplinary incidents. A strict daily schedule regulated morning inspections, ration distribution, medical examinations, and the sanitation of living areas. The women, many of whom had served as communications personnel, typists, or administrative workers, had no combat experience. They were treated not as fighters but as auxiliary staff of the former enemy state. Their status meant that, barring violations or criminal connections, many could expect relatively swift release after processing. Despite this formal structure, uncertainty permeated every part of the camp. Germany had already capitulated. Yet each prisoner existed in a personal state of suspended time, where the past was lost and the future unclear. The women tried to maintain a degree of internal order by filling their days with small tasks, sorting belongings, keeping the barracks clean, and taking short walks within the permitted area. They were living in a moment when the war outside had ended, but the emotional consequences of the war still shaped their inner world. A particularly important space was the women's sanitation block. Built in only a few days, it offered both a fragile and a protective environment. Its thin wooden walls carried the scent of freshly cut lumber, and the water system was unreliable, requiring frequent technical inspections. Yet the women valued this area deeply. It provided a rare chance for basic hygiene, something often impossible during the final months of the war. For many, this structure represented the first step toward a return to physical and emotional normality. The Allied soldiers responsible for the camp were in their own state of transition. Many had experienced the strain of battle, the loss of comrades, forced marches, and shifting orders. Now, they worked in a setting where active combat had ceased, yet strict order still had to be preserved. Some soldiers were new arrivals who had reached Europe too late to see combat at all. Determined to follow regulations precisely, they sometimes made mistakes in the fast-changing situation. This intersection of two daily routines, the women adapting to captivity and the soldiers performing technical duties, created the conditions for the incident that soon followed. Miscommunication, outdated maps, and the urgency of inspection work converged at one point. The soldiers had no intention of breaking rules. They simply followed assignments, unaware that their next step would place them at the center of a situation that would later be remembered as one of the camp's most unexpected events. By early June 1945, life in the camp had settled into a pattern of daily routines. The women, held there for several weeks, experienced a mixture of physical fatigue and emotional depletion. Most had endured the chaotic retreat of German forces, the loss of family contact, hunger, and fear of an uncertain future. For this reason, the strict discipline of the Allied camp felt to them not as a burden, but as a form of relative safety. The predictable daily rhythm offered a break from the constant anxiety that had dominated their lives in the preceding months. The primary factor shaping their psychological state was the accumulated effect of prolonged stress. Many suffered from sleep disturbances, persistent feelings of unease, and weakened immunity. Others displayed emotional numbness, a common response among people who have been exposed to repeated crises. Although the camp could not provide full psychological treatment, regular medical checkups, sanitary procedures, and a stable environment offered a partial sense of relief. Hygiene played a particularly significant role. It was not only a sanitary necessity but also an emotional anchor. During the final months of the war, many women had lived in ruined buildings, on the move, or under the constant threat of air raids. The ability to use a shower once more felt like a return to basic human dignity. The sanitation block became a symbolic space, reminding them of civilian life and of a world where order, privacy, and routine still existed. The women made a conscious effort to maintain cleanliness in this area. This was their way of protecting a small part of their restored daily structure, something they could influence despite the circumstances. Every visit to the shower block offered momentary relief, a brief encounter with normality. It represented a thin boundary between the immediate past filled with fear and the present in which a faint sense of safety was beginning to emerge. Meanwhile, the Allied soldiers continued their maintenance duties. The unstable water system demanded frequent inspections, which often required adjusting schedules and rerouting personnel. In a camp built in haste, these tasks were unavoidable. Interaction between camp staff and prisoners remained limited, as both sides were instructed to maintain distance and clear boundaries. Yet it was precisely the intersection of these two parallel routines, the women seeking to rebuild fragments of normal life and the soldiers performing technical responsibilities, that led to the unusual incident soon to unfold. It became a moment shaped not by confrontation, but by the fragile emotional landscape shared by people emerging from the shadow of war. The second half of June, 1,945 inches, the camp was marked by increased activity among the technical units. After several weeks of temporary operation, the Engineering Command decided to inspect all water and utility systems to determine which sections required repairs before the camp could be used for a longer period. Since the structures had been built hurriedly, errors in the documentation were almost inevitable. Maps were updated more slowly than construction progressed, and new engineering teams often received incomplete or outdated information. One such discrepancy became the starting point for the incident that followed. An engineering group received a map drawn during the first days of construction. According to that document, the building marked S3 was designated as a technical storage space. However, after later adjustments to the layout, that same building had been repurposed as the women's shower block. The updated schematic had been sent to headquarters, but it never reached the engineers assigned to the task. As a result, the soldiers believed they were entering an empty utility room. On the morning of the incident, the camp was unusually calm. A thin layer of fog was lifting as the June sun rose higher. The women followed their regular schedule, moving toward the sanitation block in small groups to avoid overcrowding. The atmosphere was routine and predictable, reflecting the new rhythm they had tried to build during their weeks in captivity. The engineering team proceeded along its assigned route, checking pipes, junctions, and valves. Convinced they were entering a maintenance area, they opened the door to building S3 without hesitation. No warning sign was present at that moment, as the temporary marker had reportedly been removed for replacement and was due to be reinstalled shortly. As a result, the soldiers stepped directly into the women's shower block. For an outside observer, the moment might have seemed the beginning of an awkward situation, yet the reaction of the women was unexpected. Instead of fear, alarm, or protest reactions that would have been natural under other circumstances, there was a sudden wave of emotion of a different kind. Those present perceived the soldiers' appearance not as a threat and not as a serious breach of order, but as an oddly harmless mistake. After months of tension, displacement, and danger, an unplanned accident with no risk attached to it felt strangely unreal. Psychologists later explained that such emotional responses could arise in people recovering from prolonged stress. When danger no longer dominates daily life, even an intrusive or unpredictable event can evoke relief rather than fear. The women may have interpreted the moment as proof that the war's atmosphere of constant threat was truly fading. Instead of reacting from a place of fear, they instinctively responded from a place of exhausted humanity. The soldiers realized their mistake within seconds and immediately left the building. Camp authorities quickly installed new signs and updated all engineering documentation. The official report described the event as an unintentional sector violation due to outdated planning materials. Yet those who witnessed the moment remembered it less formally. They recalled it as a brief but telling reflection of the changing emotional climate among people who were just beginning to emerge from the long shadow of war. After the incident that occurred in mid-June 1945, the camp quietly discussed what had happened, though these conversations remained informal and internal. Allied Command did not treat the episode as significant, considering it a simple organizational error. However, among the officers responsible for the psychological assessment and recovery of prisoners, curiosity emerged regarding the reasons behind the women's unusual reaction. At first glance, it might have seemed like nothing more than a moment of awkwardness, yet the emotional response suggested deeper processes at work in people who had endured severe wartime conditions. The primary explanation offered by post-war analysts was extreme nervous exhaustion. For months, and in some cases years, the women had lived in conditions where any unexpected intrusion could signal danger. They were accustomed to anticipating the worst. Yet upon arriving in the Allied camp, despite its strict rules, many felt genuinely safe for the first time in a long while. Their mental state began to shift. In such a transitional phase, a sudden event that presented no threat could trigger an emotional release rather than fear. Psychologists noted that people emerging from prolonged stress often display reactions opposite to what observers might expect. When fear is no longer the dominant force, the mind may respond to surprise with relief or even laughter. For the women in the shower block, the unexpected appearance of soldiers did not trigger the instinct of danger. Instead, it reminded them that the war, with its constant alarms and risks, was no longer shaping every moment of their lives. The event was harmless, and the harmlessness itself became emotionally striking. Another factor shaping their response was the chaos they had endured during the final months of the war. Many had witnessed destroyed towns, abrupt evacuations, loss of possessions, and constant uncertainty. In such circumstances, any event free of threat could feel strangely familiar, even comforting. A simple mistake, something normal in civilian life, could evoke the forgotten sense that human error did not always equal danger. The soldiers involved were also surprised. They had expected embarrassment, perhaps even anger, but instead encountered a reaction that left them uncertain of how to interpret it. None of them had intended to violate protocol, and the brief encounter passed without conflict. What struck some of them afterward was the realization that the women's response reflected a shared exhaustion felt on both sides. Those who once stood on opposing ends of the conflict were now united by the simple human desire for stability after prolonged hardship. The event, mentioned in official documents only in a short notation, remained in the memory of witnesses as a symbol of the transition between war and peace. It demonstrated how emotional responses in such moments rarely fit expectations and often reveal hidden processes of recovery. For the women, the incident became a fleeting but telling piece of evidence that the psychological burden of war was slowly beginning to lift. After the engineering team unintentionally crossed into the women's sanitation sector, Camp Command implemented several organizational measures to prevent similar situations in the future. Official documents recorded that the incident had not resulted in a breach of discipline, yet they emphasized the need for clearer markings and revised routes for technical inspections. Temporary signs were replaced with permanent, easily visible warnings, and all engineering diagrams were reviewed and updated. Allied officers maintained that their primary responsibility was to ensure order and uphold the standards required by the Geneva Convention. They could not allow even minor ambiguities in procedure, since the camp was subject to regular inspections. As a result, the incident was viewed chiefly as a logistical and coordination issue rather than a psychological or social one. Still, outside formal reports, some officers privately admitted that the episode reminded them of how delicate the transition from wartime to peacetime truly was. For the women prisoners, the consequences were less significant than might be expected. Their daily schedule remained unchanged, and the sanitation block continued to operate normally. However, within the women's community, the incident subtly influenced their internal dynamics. It became a rare event, suitable for discussion, without evoking memories of loss, fear, or deprivation. It provided a shared moment that stood apart from the darker stories of their wartime experiences. Researchers who later analyzed testimonies and documentation noted that such moments could play a meaningful role in restoring psychological stability. A collective experience of something unexpected, yet harmless, could help shift focus away from danger and toward normality. Even a brief feeling of relief could reinforce the sense that the war had genuinely ended and that life was gradually returning to a more predictable rhythm. Among the Allied soldiers, the event was also remembered. The technical team that had entered the sanitation block received a verbal reprimand and additional instruction, but the greater impact lay in what the incident revealed about the camp's emotional climate. Many soldiers had spent months in environments where even the smallest mistake could result in conflict or risk. Here, the same type of mistake produced a reaction that suggested a shift toward peace. The moment underscored the shared exhaustion felt by both guards and prisoners and highlighted their mutual desire for normal life. Camp Command treated the episode as a reminder of the importance of precise documentation, particularly within temporary infrastructure. In the following weeks, engineers conducted additional inspections and updated camp maps to ensure clarity and prevent future misunderstandings. Though officially minor, the incident left a noticeable imprint on the camp's internal atmosphere. It marked an informal boundary between the early period of strict adaptation to captivity and the later stage in which emotional recovery became more apparent. For both prisoners and soldiers, it was a moment that helped reinforce the idea that peace was no longer a distant prospect but an emerging reality. By the end of June 1945, the atmosphere in the camp had noticeably changed. Although the women's lives still followed a strict daily schedule, their behavior and emotional expressions shifted toward a state of reduced tension. The incident in the sanitation block, despite its informal nature, became a psychological marker that subtly influenced the relationship between the prisoners and their surroundings, helping to ease the strain that had defined their early days in captivity. The women, who had previously remained guarded and controlled in their emotions, began showing signs of initiative in everyday tasks. They organized internal responsibilities more clearly, monitored the cleanliness of areas they could maintain, and displayed increased interest in official updates and news delivered through camp administration. These small changes indicated the gradual reestablishment of the structure of normal life lost during the chaotic final months of the war. Their conversations, once dominated by themes of survival, now cautiously included thoughts about the future. Allied soldiers also sensed a change in the emotional tone of the camp. Those who had served there since its early days noted a reduction in tension between personnel and prisoners. The lingering influence of combat experience began to fade, replaced by the more stable duties associated with post-war administration. The incident in the shower block served as a reminder that human perception adapts quickly when immediate danger is removed. The reaction of the prisoners had quietly demonstrated that restoration was already underway. Camp Command observed that discipline remained stable and that conflicts were minimal. Reports indicated increased orderliness, calmness, and cooperation among the women. This was seen as a positive sign of their adjustment to captivity and of the forthcoming filtration process, during which many expected decisions about release or transfer. The prospect of a defined future, even if uncertain, contributed to a growing sense of emotional steadiness. Everyday routines played a crucial role in this shift. Actions such as receiving rations, maintaining the barracks, or following schedules for sanitation became more than obligations. They acted as tools for recovery, rebuilding the rhythm of life. The incident in the shower block, minor as it was, blended into this process as an unexpected demonstration that not all disruptions signaled danger. It symbolized a transition from a world in which errors had life-threatening consequences to one where mistakes were simply part of normal human activity. Thus, the camp gradually entered a phase in which psychological recovery became increasingly visible, and the memory of war slowly began to recede into the background. By early July 1945, Allied command accelerated the filtration process for prisoners of war, as the resources of temporary camps were limited and the broader task of stabilizing post-war Europe demanded swift action. The women who had arrived in May underwent thorough verification of their documents, personal histories, and wartime duties. Most of them had served in auxiliary roles, which simplified their review. Gradually, groups of prisoners were prepared, either for transfer to other facilities or for release back into civilian life. The atmosphere in the camp during this period resembled a collective pause before major change. Women who had recently lived in a state of extreme uncertainty now found themselves on the threshold of a new reality. The filtration process involved medical examinations, brief administrative interviews, and confirmation of personnel records. For many, these procedures signaled that the era of constant fear had finally ended. They were no longer focused solely on survival, but had begun to consider how they might rebuild their lives once they left the camp. The soldiers assigned to the camp felt the transition as well. The gradual departure of prisoners meant that their own mission was nearing completion and that they would soon move on to new duties connected with the stabilization of Europe. Those who had witnessed the incident in the shower block remembered it as a small yet meaningful moment, a sign that the emotional climate among former adversaries had shifted. They observed that the women had become more composed and confident, no longer defined by the anxiety that had accompanied them during the war's final months. Camp Command regarded the end of the filtration phase as an indication that the administrative goals had been met. Reports noted stable discipline and a remarkable absence of incidents. This stability was attributed to the gradual restoration of the women's emotional resilience. Daily routines, sanitation procedures, ration distribution, and limited outdoor walks no longer served merely as regulation, but became part of a consistent rhythm that helped soften the lingering effects of wartime stress. When the first groups of women finally left the camp, many looked back not with fear, but with the awareness that they had completed a transitional stage between the chaos of war and the uncertain but peaceful life ahead. For them, the incident in the shower block remained a peculiar moment that had revealed an important truth, even in captivity. Glimpses of normal human experience could resurface unexpectedly and help reconnect them with the idea of everyday life. Thus, their time in the camp came to an end, a period in which an accidental event helped mark the beginning of their return from the long shadow of war.